Okay, I guess it's recording.
It says it is,
Okay,
or it told me it was.
All right. So before I forget, I had talked last time about having the next herb walk this coming weekend. As it turns out, I'm going to have to do that on Sunday. So I hope that will work for people. I'd like to meet at noon on Sunday at Tom Dorman Nature Sanctuary in Garrett County. If anybody wants to carpool down there, let me know from Lexington. And if people just want to meet there, that works too. But I'd like to meet at the same place that we went last year in the parking lot area, and then we'll go into the woods from there. And there should be some nice springtime woodland stuff growing, and it should be a really great time because the trees haven't leafed out yet. Forest floor should still be nice and active as far as plants' life cycles go, and so we should have a good opportunity to see some interesting things in the woods this weekend, and hopefully the weather will cooperate. Yes, noon on Sunday, noon on this coming Sunday, which is what, March 26th? Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, March 26th at noon at Tom Dorman Nature Sanctuary in Garrett County, Kentucky, for anyone who can make that. And like before, I will do some recording. Hopefully we'll be able to do more extensive recording this time, because last time we didn't end up with that much footage from the amount of time that we were out there. So hope to improve upon that this time. Yeah, today I want to talk about keeping an apothecary, keeping essentially an area where you keep all your medicines together, and how to go about that, and what's helpful for that, and how that's helpful for making yourself a better herbalist. So the word apothecary is an old word in English. It comes from a Greek word, apotheca, which basically means just a small shop. Same thing that taverna means in Latin, apotheca in Greek. When they got into English, tavern ended up meaning a place to buy alcohol and drink alcohol, and apothecary ended up meaning a drugstore or place that sells medicine. So in most places in the United States, apothecary is actually a protected term that you can't use for a business or something like that unless you have a licensed pharmacist. But a lot of herbalists do. If you go on Instagram, there are a lot of people making herbal products and selling them and have apothecary in their name. And it's a kind of a perilous thing to do legally, because the state pharmacist board could come after you at any time and make you stop. But generally it seems to not be an issue for the people that are doing it. At least I haven't heard of many people getting in trouble for it, or the trouble would most likely just be that they tell you to stop. But that could be a hassle as far as brand recognition and everything goes, if you had to change your name all of a sudden. But in the world of herbal medicine, we often use the word apothecary just to mean your collection of herbal medicines. So, I've got all mine, not all of mine. I've got a lot of mine here in this room with me. I keep about 1,000 different herbal medicines that I use in my practice. And that's different species of herbs. And with some herbs, there's more than one preparation from the same species. So for example, I might have hawthorn leaf and flower extract, as well as hawthorn berry as a tincture. And maybe sometimes, although not right at this moment, I'll also have hawthorn berry vinegar. or well, I call it cider, but it's kind of vinegary. So I might have all those different preparations that are made from the same plant. Same with elderberry. I've got elderberry wine. I've got elderberry tincture. I've got elder flower tincture. I've got elder bark by itself. And then I often have elderberry gummies as well. So, lots of things like that where there are multiple items from the same species, but altogether I've got about 1,000 different things in my apothecary that I can give people. My dad usually had about 20 that he would give people. So, it can be all different sizes is the point that I'm making there. You can have 10 or 20 herbs that you use for most things and that you keep on hand, and that can be sufficient for a wide range of different complaints that might come up for a household or for a community, just depending on the scope of what you're doing with it. I like to have a large number because I like to be able to use subtle different variations for different people, depending on their constitutions and stuff like that. I've known older herbalists, traditional herbalists who were part of longstanding folk traditions and things like that, that really only used a few different remedies, that only used a few different things. And that was very common in the community that I grew up in, that somebody would have 3 or 4 different medicines that they used for a wide variety of things. Sometimes it's like that. I've also met people who had one particular medicine that they used not for everything, but that was their medicine. That you might have somebody who worked with a particular plant, and they were the person to go to when you needed treated with that particular plant. And that's definitely another way of people doing things. But in this course, we will have by the end talked about around 100 different medicinal plants. We're talked in some depth about 100 different medicinal plants. And if you go out into the environment around you, you'll probably find 50 to 100 plants that you can find abundantly in your environment without a whole lot of effort. And that's something that, often influences what plants we keep in our apothecary, what plants we use for people, is what's readily available to us. So I have probably a couple hundred that I use really frequently, probably have 50 that I use really frequently. And then I have a couple hundred that I use on something of a regular basis. And then I have several hundred more that I don't use that often, but that I do keep around for the occasion when I would want them. And these are things that are not first line treatments. By first line treatments, I mean, if somebody comes to me with a particular condition, I'm going to start out by giving them something that usually works and that is generally well tolerated. And if that doesn't work, I might go up to something that's stronger, but maybe not as well tolerated, maybe needs to be used with more care, that sort of thing. And so that would be more of a second line treatment, and so on. So a lot of the herbs that I don't use frequently wouldn't be my first choice for any particular condition, but might be something that I would use if the first choice didn't work out for whatever reason. So a good example of that in my apothecary would be digitalis. I probably use it once a year. It's quite poisonous. The only time I use it is when I have already tried a couple other herbs to get someone's heartbeat to regularize, and it hasn't worked out. So, normally if somebody's having a little bit of an erratic heartbeat, I would try motherwort, and motherwort usually works. And if motherwort didn't work, there's another herb called lily of the valley, which is a little bit poisonous, but not terribly poisonous. And I would use that in a low dose form and see if that worked. And it usually does in cases where motherwort doesn't work. And in the rare case where neither of them works, I would try very, very small doses of digitalis while somebody is here with me. I never send anybody home with it. And try to get things back to normal. So that's why I have so many herbs. But for the most part, for general use, you probably have a few dozen that you use really regularly. And that's how it is for just about every herbalist, just about everywhere, is they'll have a relatively small collection of herbs that they use for most things in most scenarios. So I think that that's a really good place to start if you're going to be setting up an apothecary for yourself, for your home, is to make a list of a few dozen herbs that you would like to use, that you have ready access to, and that sort of thing, and then make medicine from them. And when you're getting that set up, if you were to do it all at once, it would be a very significant investment. If I were to go to a site like Frontier or something like that and order a pound of every herb that I like to use, and order the stuff I would need to make tinctures out of it and the jars that I would need to put it in, and do it all at once, that would be a huge expenditure. But I don't do it like that. I built it slowly, and I replace things as I go along as they're in season. So it might be good to start out with a few things. Maybe start out with the things that are in flower right now, or whenever you decide to start on the process, and make some tinctures of them. I know some of you already have made tinctures of lots of different things over the course of this course, and I think that's really great. And I think that continuing with that going forward is a really good way, both to keep in touch with the natural world around you, and also to prepare for the possibility of someone needing the help. So, for example, this week you might go out and make some dandelion tincture. The dandelions wouldn't cost you anything, and the materials would cost you a little bit. And then next week you do something else. And, it's easy enough to make. I often make tinctures in this size, half gallons. Sometimes I make them in gallons or multiple gallons at a time. But if you don't have a whole lot of people that you're treating, a half gallon of tincture will last you quite a while. And it's not that much more trouble to make a half gallon than it is to make a pint. So, if you're making things in that kind of quantities, and let's say you wanted to have 40 or 50 of them, or maybe 25 or 30 of them, you just need like a couple of shelves like this. This right here is a wooden shelving unit that costs about $20 or so. They sell them all over town. I think I got that one at Meijer, but they're pretty easy to come by, and they're stackable and things like that. So it's something that you can expand on, but it's a good place to start. And you can fit a dozen or so of the half gallon jars on each shelf. So if you had 4 shelves with a dozen jars on each of them, that would be a really nice strong storage, strong set of things to have on hand, and it wouldn't take up that much space in your home or in your office or wherever. So it's a good economical and practical way to do it. That shelf, it takes up about 3.5 feet by 1.5 feet. So it's pretty small. It doesn't take up a lot of floor space, and it'll not cost you that much, and is easy to expand upon if you need to. So that's a good type of thing to do to start with. It doesn't have to be that, if you have a closet with shelves in it, that's really great because it keeps it out of the light. But I think it's really a good idea to have it all together. And rather than just having, a few things in a bunch of different kitchen cabinets or something like that, to have it all together in one place where you can see it all at once. You can visualize it all at once. You can think about it more easily that way because you can see it all laid out at once and know what you have and what your choices are for using something to try and help someone. And I really feel like, in a way, having everything collected together like that, it's almost as if it concentrates the power, concentrates the energy of your ability to heal people, because all of your tools for doing so are right there together, and it makes them easier to find and things like that. So it's I very much recommend keeping everything together where you can, take as much of it as possible in at one glance. I obviously can't take everything that I have in one glance, but I can take all the stuff that I use frequently see it all in one glance. And I find that very helpful. So, just having them all together, having a space that's dedicated to that's dedicated to your practice and to your collection of plant medicines, to your plant medicine toolkit, so that you have everything you need there, and having the stuff that goes with it in the same area as well can be a good idea. For example, like a mortar and pestle, or a notebook that you keep notes in, or bottles that you'll dispense things into to give to people and stuff like that. Just kind of keeping it all collected really helps make it so that it's ready to hand when you need it. And you don't have to, if somebody's having a health issue and you're thinking about that, you can just think about that and not have to think so much about where's all my stuff. And I really feel like the process of concentrating the things really helps to concentrate the thoughts and the actions that go with them. Kind of helps to focalize your practice as an herbalist and your abilities as an herbalist into one place. So when you're doing that, a couple things you want to think about are what containers you're going to use and how you're going to protect the material from light and from the elements, and how you're going to organize it. So early on in my practice, pretty much all of my containers were like this, amber glass jars. They're more expensive, but they do keep ultraviolet light from damaging the herbs. A lot of the time now I don't use them because I don't keep the things around for long enough for it to make as much difference. But if I were keeping herbs on hand for longer, it would be more important. But I'm keeping them somewhere in the dark until I'm ready to use them, and then I'm bringing them out here, and then they don't last very long once they're in, once they're actively out and ready to be used. So depending on how long you're going to keep herbs, if you're going to keep them for a year or longer, you really want to have, really, if you're going to keep them even as long as a year in tincture form, you really want to either have them in the dark or in protective glass that's going to prevent light from getting to them. When possible, it's nice to have lids that are not metal, because metal lids, especially if the stuff in the jar is acidic, like if it's in a vinegar base or something like that, metal lids can rust and it can ruin the medicine. So it's possible to get non-metallic lids for mason jars now. There are also jars that have glass lids. If you can get cork lids, those look really fancy too. But metal lids for a tincture are okay for short-term storage, but they can they can get rusty. And so you have to check them and replace them often if they're starting to. In this room, I keep everything out, not really shielded from the light because it's not going to last very long. But if you were keeping it in your home and it was going to be there for a while, you might want to have some kind of cloth in front of them that would cut down a lot of the light, or else have them in a closet or a room where it was not going to be exposed to a lot of bright light, and especially sunlight, because sunlight really will break down plant compounds pretty quickly. It's the same energy that puts them together, and it will just as easily break them apart and turn them into other substances. So if you want the medicines to last, you have to protect them from sunlight. So also, just like we talked about when you're making medicines, 3 things that make the substance leave the plant material quickly into the medicine itself, into the liquid part of the medicine, if you're making a liquid extract, are the size of the pieces. The smaller they are, the faster the substances disperse from the plant material. The temperature, the warmer it is, the faster the substances disperse out of the plant material, and any kind of agitation or movement. Now, with storage, agitation and movement isn't usually an issue, but the other 2 can be. And just like they will make the substances come out of the plant material into a solution, they'll also make those substances come out of the plant material into the air. They will make the plant material lose its virtues more quickly. So if you have something, say, just in a paper bag, for instance, some herbs that you've dried and you've got them in a paper bag to keep the dust off of them, then the longer it's in there, the more it's going to lose its potency. The warmer the room is, the more it's going to lose its potency, and the smaller pieces it's in. So if it's powder, it's actually going to lose potency faster than if it's in whole, larger pieces. So that's something to keep in mind when you're storing stuff. And in my practice, I usually, with most substances, with most plant material, I usually don't leave it in the dried herb form for a really long time, unless if it's something that I'm going to use in that form, then I'll usually put it in a glass jar, let it dry out completely, so I know it's not going to be sweating and causing condensation and molding inside the jar. But then once it's dried out completely, putting it into an amber glass jar where it will be protected from the light and where the substances won't be able to dissipate as easily out of it. So keeping it in some kind of a sealed container, keeping it cool, dry, and out of the light will help it to last longer. So, it's important to be thinking about that. If you'd like to have, for example, a selection of herbal teas, you really want to keep them. You need to do more to keep them from going bad than you would with tinctures, because in a tincture, the stuff is already out of the plant material and into the liquid, and it's going to stay there unless something happens to the liquid. In some leaves for tea, it's going to come out of them and into the air if it's allowed to. Becca says she found large amber glass ball mason jars on Amazon. That's good. Yeah, I've seen some of them. I can't find gallon size amber glass jars anymore. At least last time I looked for them, I was not able to find them, but they do have half gallon size ones. So I really like them for the look as much as anything. I like them for the fact that they do protect the herbs too. And so in my mobile clinic, where I'm not going through things as fast because I'm not using the mobile clinic as much, I do have everything in amber glass jars. And then I have those amber glass jars put away where they're out of the light. They're stored kind of under the tables or beds, depending on how you use them, in the front room of my medicine wagon. So that's how I do it in a more low turnover type of environment. Here the turnover is really high, and make medicines and have them put away somewhere and then bring them out here and use them. And, if I have a half a gallon jar and then I make an 8-ounce bottle of medicine for, what, 8 people, then that's it. That'll use up that whole jar. So it goes pretty fast. But when I was seeing fewer people and that sort of thing, I kept stuff around for quite a bit longer. So yeah, you want to pay attention to how you're keeping things so that it's preserved. You want to pay attention to where you're keeping things so that it's collected for everybody, for you to use for everybody when you need it. And you want to also pay attention to how you're arranging things in your apothecary. It can be confusing or time wasting to have a bunch of stuff that's on the shelf randomly and you don't know where it is. And it's also very hard to tell anybody else where it is if you don't already know where it is. So a good thing to do is to label all of the jars. And I think that the most intuitive and most straightforward way to arrange them is to do it alphabetically by the common name. Because if you do it by the Latin name, you might not remember what the Latin name for that plant was, unless you're really familiar with it. Maybe you won't forget it, but a lot of the time, this is how herb books are organized, is alphabetically by common name. And it's also a pretty reasonable way to organize your apothecary. There are other ways to do it. You could put all the herbs for one particular issue together, but with a lot of herbs, they're useful for multiple different things, so that can get confusing. Does yarrow go with wound herbs, or does it go with fever herbs, or something like that? Is ginger for inflammation, or is it for nausea? So that can be confusing. But if you know the name ginger, you can just find it alphabetically, and that's a pretty straightforward way to do it. The only downside to that is some things do have more than one common name, and you might not remember whether you labeled something as life everlasting or you labeled it as rabbit tobacco. Not that you would necessarily be using that particular herb, but if you were, either of those names is a common name for it, and you might not remember which one you put on the label. There is a document called Herbs of Commerce that has like the official common names of different plants that are what they're sold under. But short of something that official or whatever, they do have multiple different common names that aren't necessarily that are kind of interchangeable. What have we got here? Oh yeah, these are Becca shared a picture of the half-gallon wide mouth amber canning jars. Those are lovely. And so, yeah, those will make things last longer, especially if you're keeping something in some sort of a long-term storage. And then the real trick to having an apothecary and maintaining an apothecary is keeping track of what you have and replacing things when they need replaced. And so that is a whole practice unto itself. It's probably a good idea to have a notebook and periodically, maybe a couple times a year, just go through everything and write a whole new list of everything you have and how much of it you have, and whether you need to go get more or whether you're good on it for now, and when the last time you replaced it was. So for instance, let's say you've got some echinacea root, right? And there's a particular time of year to harvest echinacea root, which is either early in the year when it's first starting to put up leaves, or else later on after it's gone to seed. So maybe you'd be harvesting it early in the year and making a tincture of it. And a lot of years you might not use that whole tincture. You might not use that whole jar of tincture. But if you don't use it the second year, it's going to lose most of its potency. It's going to pretty quickly start losing that tingly flavor on the tongue that it gives, and similarly, that stimulating property that it gives to the immune system. Those are going to dwindle over the course of the second year. So even though you have a full jar, if you don't remember when you made up that jar and everything, you might find that you don't have good medicine anymore. So it's a good idea to keep track of what you have, when you put it there, and you can put that, and it's normal to put that on the jar, to put something like Echinacea tincture, April 2023. And but also it's a good idea to put that down in a book, because labels that are on jars that are full of liquids can get messed up pretty easily when you're pouring stuff out of them. If it's, Echinacea root that's in a bag or in a it's just dried in a jar or something like that, you want to definitely put the label on that too, as to when it's from, so that you know when it needs to be replaced. And a lot of herbs will keep for multiple years. I think let me show you something that I wanted to share here. This is a jar of valerian that I'm smelling, and I think I've probably told this story before because I just love this story. But the jar that it's in is an apothecary jar that was specifically made for storing medicine. You can see that it is not amber glass. It is just regular clear glass. The stopper is a ground glass stopper where the glass kind of just rubs up and frictions itself closed against the sanded glass in the neck of the bottle. And it forms a very airtight type of seal. And this valerian has a strong smell to it. And this valerian was part of Transylvania Medical School's apothecary. Transylvania had a medical school that closed down in the 1860s. This picture is from 2021. And so at this point, this jar of herbs is at least 160 years old, possibly a bit older than that. And it still smells pretty strongly like valerian. And so the smell is caused by a substance called isovaleric acid, which is part of what gives valerian, a big part of what gives valerian its medicinal properties. So, presumably it would still have some of its medicinal properties. It wasn't full strength. You could definitely tell that it was aged, but it wasn't the weakest valerian I've ever smelled. So, storing right can make up for, or let me put it differently, storing it badly can make it go bad much faster than storing it right, but keeping it a long time. So in this particular case, this is valerian that's been around for more than a century and a half, and still smells like valerian, still has some of the substances in it that make it powerful. It was kept in the dark for the vast majority of its history, packed away in crates, but not necessarily protected from the elements all that well as far as temperature, climate control goes. because it was in a storage room that wasn't like, certainly wasn't air conditioned in the 1860s, right? But wasn't necessarily well climate controlled, even in more recent times. So that's an example of how storing something right can make it last a lot longer. But with anything, you want to make sure that you're replacing it fairly frequently, just to have the best possible practices. The longest I keep anything is 5 years. If something is very aromatic, I usually will not keep it more than 2 years, and I'll check it and smell it and see if it still smells good. And if it does, then great. And if it's after 2 years, even though it might still have all of its smell and taste and stuff, I'll usually compost it. I try not to waste anything at all if I can help it. So I try not to let it come to that. But it's better to waste some herbs than to give someone some bad medicine. So avoid either if at all possible. But if you have to choose between the two, don't give people second-rate medicine. I'm going to spell the acid name. I'm going to type it. It is ISOVALERIC, acid. And there's isovaleric acid and valerian are mood stabilizing and calming and anticonvulsant. So back in the 1800s, it was probably the drug of choice for controlling seizures. And even nowadays, propylvaleric acid, otherwise known as valproic acid, is one of the main seizure drugs that are prescribed. So it's a slightly different compound that is based on compounds found in valerian. So
is that what makes it
storing
smell like
things
a
right
sweaty
is really
gym stock?
important, and keeping track of what you have and how long you've had it and when you need more is important to managing your medicine collection, your medicine chest in a good and effective way. So taking notes is important. If you have certain herbs that you're developing a relationship with, then that is really often very helpful to this. Let's say you have, 5 or 6 herbs that you're going to grow, and let's say you have 5 or 6 other herbs that you're going to get really familiar with harvesting from the wild. Then, when it grows, that's time to make more medicine out of it. When it's in season, when it's blooming, coming into its bloom, if it's a flowering plant that you're growing, or when it's in fruit, if it's a fruit that you're growing like cayenne, or if it's something like a bark like sassafras that you're going out and harvesting at a specific time, or a plant like dandelion that you would harvest when it blooms. Knowing the natural cycles of the plant and being in tune with the natural cycles of the plant and working in harmony with those natural cycles of the plant is going to make sure that you have it when you need it. So really, to me, being a good herbalist is all about relationships. It's all about the medicine side of it is all about your relationships with the plants. And the clinical side of it is all about your relationships with the community of people whose herbalist you are. And so it's really all about these interconnectednesses and these relationships. And that's, I think, a really powerful thing. And I think that the more that you're in tune with that, the better you're going to do with it, the better you're going to be as an herbalist, the more powerful you're going to be, and the more effective you're going to be. So, keeping track of an apothecary, managing an apothecary is a really great step for gaining that power, because the clinical side of things takes time. It takes time and experience. And as Hippocrates says, experience is dangerous and difficult. Well, experience is dangerous and decision is difficult is actually what he said. But the general idea that, experience can be hard to come by, and nobody starts out knowing what to do in all different situations. So that part of it takes time, but managing the apothecary and developing the relationships with plants is something that you can do straight out of the gate. From the very beginning of your process, you can be gathering plants and making medicines of them and learning their cycles and their relationships. And I think that that is a very vital thing to do to be a really good herbalist. And I think that it's something that is missing from some people, that, some people are familiar with what remedy to use for what situation, but they don't necessarily have that piece of things. And sometimes it really, shows in the depth of understanding that they have, or the depth of ability to bring the medicine to bear in a given situation. So, I really strongly encourage everybody who's serious about herbalism to set up an apothecary in your home and maintain it. And, it's almost like a little altar or temple in a way. It's a sacred space. It's a very special, set apart kind of place. I don't mean to make it religious really, but it's a set apart, special place that is, made for you to do this particular kind of work with, and that's separate from and removed in a way from the rest of the household or the rest of the world, so that you can go into herbalist mode when you're there and be thinking in those terms and conceptualizing things in those terms, and developing those relationships with the medicines. So that's the management of what you have and when you have it is kind of a big part of it. It doesn't take much focus or necessarily togetherness of your resources around herbal medicine to be able to just occasionally go out and pick some things and make some medicines out of them. And, if it's just something you're doing for fun, that's fine. But if you really want it to be a serious thing that is a tool for helping your community, then, keeping it all together and keeping it in a more focused and cyclical type of way, where you're, periodically replacing things, periodically checking on what you have and so forth, is really important. Beyond all that, there's the selection of what goes into your particular apothecary. I haven't ever made up like an essential medicines list of what I think everybody should have in their apothecary, because I don't necessarily think that everybody needs to have the same stuff in their apothecary. And I think that most of us find that we like working with a particular plant, that we like working with a particular remedy. And so we'll kind of make choices from there. But I think it's good to be thinking in terms of, as we've gone through all the different structures and functions and systems of the body, to have a few different herbs that are for the digestive system, a few different herbs that are for the nervous system, a few different herbs that are for the immune system. And so that you're well-rounded enough in the things that you have to choose from, that you can work on a variety of different situations. And I also think that it's important to have a mixture of different forms of medicine. Like, for instance, most of the things I have are liquid extracts to take internally, but I also have over here have some salves, some oils, some things that are to be used topically. And then I also have some things like moxa, which are treatments that are used, herbs that are used for specific therapeutic treatments that are not taken internally. In the case of moxa, it's more like a burning, smudging type of situation where you're working on different points on the skin through burning herbs and stimulating points with them. Some people like essential oils and use a variety of essential oils for topical stuff. That's not really been something that I've worked with much, but I know that some people do. I've worked with some, but not a whole lot. But having a variety of different forms and having a variety of different substances is really helpful in having a well-rounded apothecary and having a powerful, versatile apothecary that can be used for a lot of different situations. On the whole, I think there are some situations that we've talked about that are very common. I've tried to give a good guideline through the course of this class of what sorts of things you might end up seeing a lot of, both within your immediate circle of family and friends, or if you were to go into clinical practice later on, what sorts of things you might expect to see frequently. And so, having different herbs for all the different types of things that we've talked about is a good idea. If you were to have all the different herbs that we've talked about in the course of this class, that would be, a pretty large collection, but it would also be a pretty versatile, and generally most of them are fairly well tolerated herbs, pretty strong set of things that you could use. For the most part, the things that I keep in my apothecary are simples. So they're not compounded things. I do keep a few compounds like fire cider, for instance, that I have some of here, which I was giving out to people to taste at the open house. Yeah, I have some different, a few different things like that combine multiple herbs. But most of the time, I just compound them as needed as I go along, rather than making multiple herb formulas. And not everybody does it that way. In traditional Chinese medicine and in traditional Eastern Kentucky medicine, it's very common to have a formula or a remedy that consists of multiple different things blended together and allowed to steep together for months and then applied as needed. So, it's not the usual way I do it, but my way is not the only way. And there are other people who manage things a little differently, but I think that the guidelines that I'm giving as far as developing relationships with the plants and keeping the apothecary as a special place that is, where your healing abilities are focused is pretty universal, is pretty helpful. Early on, when I was first getting started, I was sort of working out of a backpack, and I just had a very small collection, a very small volume of different herbs that I was using. And it made it so much easier when I was able to switch to having a stationary base to work from, where I had all my stuff together in one place and could have larger amounts of it and that sort of thing. So I've gotten to see what it's like not to have that, and I've gotten to see what it's like to have that. And I think that it makes you a much better herbalist if you keep a good apothecary for your practice. There's a question of whether the isovaleric acid was what makes valerian smell like feet. Yeah, that's exactly what makes it smell that way. There's another substance in it called valeric acid, which is a similar substance, and it smells sweet and fruity. And then the isovaleric acid smells like deeper and funky, kind of like a lot of people say it smells like sweaty socks or like feet or something like that. And foot sweat does contain isovaleric acid. There is some degree of isovaleric acid, some quantity of isovaleric acid being produced in the body at any given time. It is a substance that our bodies use themselves to help regulate the nervous system. And we have, enzymes that help break it down so that it doesn't build up to dangerous levels and things like that. So it's very well tolerated. But yeah, it does have that funky smell to it. And that's exactly what it smelled like in that jar 160 years later, 160 something years later. Yeah, so it is a volatile substance that does evaporate into the air. So that partly made me surprised that it stuck around as long as it did. For example, by contrast, oak bark contains tannins, and the tannins in oak bark will stick around basically forever unless it starts to decay or something, unless the bark itself starts to decay like it would if it were wet. So tannins basically don't go anywhere. They're very stable substances, but they don't evaporate either. They don't go out into the air and give the oak bark a strong smell or anything. Not in the same way. So they're what's called a non-volatile substance, and the valeric acid and isovaleric acid are volatile substances. They're organic acids that evaporate. So they're, more prone to be lost into the air. But in the case of something that's kept in a sealed jar, if they go out into the air, they just go out into the air that's in the jar, and then they settle from that air back into the root. And so they don't necessarily leave the system entirely, or at least not much of them does. Some of it might break down, some of it might, escape when the jar is opened or something like that. Some of it has to escape for you to be able to smell it, but not much. A little enough that it's still, still has its characteristic smell 6 generations later or whatever. Give me just a minute. I'll be right back. All right. So one of the herbs that I wanted to talk to you about today is this stuff right here. This is a lichen called reindeer moss. Its Latin name is Cladonia rangiferina. Sometimes it's called Cladina instead of Cladonia. It used to be in a separate genus called Cladina, but now that's been merged with the genus Cladonia. It grows on the ground. It grows on bare ground, generally speaking, like rock or dirt that doesn't have anything else growing on it. And it's a lichen that has a branching form to it. So it's kind of shaped similar to usnea, which we talked about before, but instead of growing on trees, it grows on the ground. And instead of being sort of dangling and wispy, it's more like a little tiny bush made out of lichen. And so sometimes people use it for miniature cities to make, or miniature railroads and things like that, to make little bushes out of, because that's what it looks like. It is a really interesting plant for a number of reasons. Really, it's not exactly a plant, it's a lichen, but plant-like thing. It does photosynthesize, but most of the body of it is a fungus. And like other lichens, it contains two different types of cells from two different domains of life. It's got the actual structure of it is made out of fungus, and then it has a skin essentially made out of algae, and it has tissue that contains both types of cells mixed together. And then, just like everything else, it has yeast and bacteria that live on the surface of it, and they're part of it, part of the whole thing too, part of its metabolism and all that. So it's got some things in it that are typical of fungi, like beta glucan, which is a polysaccharide, a special starch that helps feed the immune system, that's in pretty much all mushrooms and fungi and things like that. It's also got some more typical algae type compounds in it. Contains a little bit of vitamin B12. It contains chlorophyll. It contains some carotenoids, which are plant compounds that are also photosynthetic. And then it contains some substances that are not found anywhere except in lichens, like usnic acid. And then it contains some other acids of its own that aren't found in usnea and that aren't found in other lichens. And it contains a sort of sugar alcohol called mannitol. Mannitol is in a number of plants, but I'm going to talk about the mannitol and the acids for a minute. The mannitol gets absorbed in the small intestine and gets secreted through the kidneys. It's sort of like a sugar and sort of like an alcohol. And so that class of substances has the catchy name of sugar alcohols. And what happens when somebody takes mannitol is that some of it gets absorbed into their bloodstream and excreted through their kidneys. But when it gets in the kidneys, the kidneys are trying to wash it out, but because it's a sort of sticky substance, it doesn't come out as easily. So the kidneys pass through a whole lot of fluid trying to wash it out. And that gives it a pretty strong diuretic effect. And it's what's called an osmolar diuretic, which is just that action of the kidneys trying to wash it out and it drawing in a lot of water. And the thing about osmolar diuretics is that they drain a lot of water out of the system without draining a lot of other substances. So it's mostly just water that's coming out with that particular action. Corn silk is another diuretic that has that action, and it has that more purely. That's really the only thing that's going on with corn silk is that type of a diuretic action, as far as I know. So it's a very pure diuretic that just makes more water come out of your system without making anything else come out and without really doing much else, which is what you want in some situations and not in others. In reindeer moss, that's only part of what's going on. The other part is that the acids are stimulating certain parts of the kidneys and causing them to flush out some other substances as well, electrolytes as well as water. But they're also going to have an antiseptic property as they pass through the kidneys and everything downstream from the kidneys. So they're really good at killing bacteria in those areas and at flushing out bacteria. And because of their higher pH, they'll also break up stones that might not be able to break up in just urine. So they're making, lower pH. They're making the urine more acidic, and that acidity can sometimes help to dissolve stones. or cause them to break up into smaller pieces. So it's a good thing for helping someone pass kidney stones. And it's also a good thing for helping to get rid of bladder and urinary tract and kidney infections. And that's mostly what I use it for. It's one of the main things that I would use in those types of situation. It's somewhat ecologically sensitive because it only grows in certain areas. It only likes to grow on bare ground. And so it might not be locally abundant. And the other thing about it is it grows very slowly. So if you look at it, you can sometimes tell the age of it. If you had a clump of this about the size of a baseball, or about the size of a baseball cut in half, I should say, that would probably take 10 or 20 years to grow. Sometimes you'll see it much, much larger than that. And people have estimated that sometimes the center of it tends to decay, so you can't always tell how big it was originally. But some people estimate that it might live for 200 years or so. The other thing that it does is sometimes it will blow around and it will roll around in the wind and land in a new place and start growing in a new place. So it is sort of a migratory lichen, sort of like a little tumbleweed. But the way that I make it is similar to the process I described for usnea, which is soaking it in alcohol and then making an infusion of it in boiling water, so that you end up with something that's about 10 to 20% alcohol finished product. And that gets out the starches that are in it, which are immune supporting, and it also gets out the acids and the sugar alcohols and things like that that are diuretic and anti-infective. It has a wider range of traditional uses, including as an animal food, because reindeer eat it. People can eat it if they're hungry enough, but it's a good idea for them to soak it in water and get some of the acidity out of it. And then once you've done that, is because it's very acrid if you just try to eat it raw, and it's very hard when it's dry as well. But if you soak it in water for a while and get some of the acidity out of it, then it can be used like other mushrooms as food, and has similar nutritional qualities to them. So people have eaten it in hard times. People don't usually eat it, but people have eaten it in hard times, and animals eat it. Caribou and reindeer eat it pretty consistently, and that's why it's called reindeer moss. Depending on the environment that they live in, barren ground caribou, the ones that live the furthest north, it's maybe half of their diet or so. So it's got protein in it, it's got starches in it, it's pretty nutritious, really, other than the fact that it's very acidic. But in terms of practical medicinal uses, I mainly use it as a diuretic and anti-infective for the kidneys and urinary tract. It's also been used as absorbent material because it is very absorbent. When it's totally dry, it's very stiff. But if you get it dry, if you get it wet and then wring the wetness out of it, it's a lot like a sponge. It has lots of hollow spaces in it. So it can, like, if someone makes a poultice out of it and puts it on a draining or bleeding wound, it will draw the liquid into those interstices, into those hollow spaces, and hold it there and absorb it slowly into the actual tissue of the plant material and turn it into a sort of a gelatinous substance. So it's really good at helping absorb stuff from draining wounds. In the north, in the northern part of Finland, where I first learned about it, some people there had a tradition of using it for packing it in a wound and then lighting it to sort of cauterize the wound. That's not something I've ever had occasion to do with it, but it is a traditional use for it, just being able to heat a wound by putting that absorbent and flammable stuff on it and then lighting it. But you know, that's a dramatic measure and not one that I've really had to resort to myself. But it was the best thing in their environment for that, and so that's what they had the tradition of using. Not that anyone was still doing that when I was there in the 90s, but it was, you know, a use that people knew of, that they remembered. You could use some other lichens like that as a poultice. The reason this one works better than a lot of them is because it has more hollow spaces inside of the branches. They're more like little tubes that will suck up liquid. So it will actually absorb more liquid than other lichens, and also have its antiseptic properties too. But yeah, you can use other lichens, and people have used other lichens for that same purpose, especially branching lichens, what are called fruticose lichens, which are the kinds that are like stringy and branchy rather than the flat kind. Those ones they're not very absorbent at all. They're still somewhat antiseptic though, so they still have been used for wounds for other reasons. So yeah, when gathering that, it's important to not take more than 1/10 of any given stand, and then to give that stand time to recover to its full size before taking any more from it. Because depending on growing conditions, it can grow very slowly. I know clumps of it that are pretty large, but look exactly the same as they looked 20 years ago. So I don't really harvest from them because they just, you know, they're not in an active growing phase. They're just kind of holding ground. So if you live somewhere where it's locally very abundant, which would include the tundras, but also in the Knobs region of Kentucky, there's a lot of it on bare sandstone. It doesn't like as much to grow on the limestone that we have here in central Kentucky. But once you get to Berea, or once you get to Red River Gorge, and you start to have sandstone on top of the mountains, it likes to grow there. It likes to grow on sandy soil and sandstone, often directly on the rock. It can live on places that look a lot like the moon, that don't have a lot of other vegetation already growing there. And sometimes it's what starts vegetation growing. So it'll be the first thing to grow on bare rock. And then something like maple tree seeds will start to land in the gaps in the branchy, bushy lichen and grow there, almost like a hydroponic system. So they don't have any dirt, but they have something around them that holds them up and that holds water when it rains. And so then you get these naturally occurring hydroponic maple trees with their root systems holding any sort of plant material and stuff that's breaking down, holding everything in place, and then it builds soil. It's not only maple trees, it's also some other trees that are early comers to bare spaces like that, which would include most of your berry type things like blackberries and raspberries and cedar trees and multifloral roses, which are an invasive species, but they'll often show up in that scenario as well. And all of these trees are and bushes and branches, they're kind of thicket forming, they're kind of protective. So they'll hold the soil as it's being formed, and also keep foot traffic of people and animals to a minimum, and allow some succession to happen, allow other things to start growing there. So you can often find a whole ecosystem starting out in mats of this plant and, growing hydroponically as soil is getting formed. And, it can take a long time for soil to form, but they actually help to speed that process up. So they play a pretty vital role in the ridgetop micro ecosystem that we have here in some parts of eastern Kentucky. And so again, if you're going to harvest them at all, harvest a small amount and harvest it very infrequently from the same spot. Maybe take a little bit and come back in several years and see if it's grown back, and if not, leave it alone. But usually it will grow some, just not a whole lot in any given year. So you have to be very careful about harvesting it so that it's not being over harvested. And it's kind of like it's a plant that I've talked about some in lectures and talked about some in classes like this, but I've hesitated to publish much on it, even though I went out into places where people were using it, and found that it had all these different uses. And there's actually been quite a bit of research into the chemistry of it as well. But I don't want it to become a popular herb just because I don't think that it and capitalism are a good match for each other, because if it was something very easily to sell, that people would go in and pick it all and eradicate populations of it pretty easily, and then the forest would be without it, or the ridge tops would be without it, and it would be something of a tragedy, something of a pretty intense change in that habitat. It's also eaten by deers in the winter, especially. They'll eat little bits of it. It's not the best tasting stuff, like I said, but it is pretty nutritious. And so white-tailed deer, the ones that we have around here, they won't usually browse down a whole big area of it, but they will eat it during the winter when there's not a lot of other food to be had. So I try to be careful, try to be mindful of the fact that I'm not the only one using it. I also try to, if at all possible, harvest it from areas that deer wouldn't really easily be able to get to, like the tops of boulders. Although sometimes deer can surprisingly get to places you wouldn't expect them to. Another plant that I wanted to talk to you about today is Thuja occidentalis. This is a plant that I've been working on making a video about, but I haven't got it all put together yet. But Thuja occidentalis is sometimes called, here, let me write that down. That is THUJAOCCIDENTALIS. Sorry, hang on a second. So this plant is sometimes called northern white cedar in English. That's a lot of the time what people call it who live where it grows. In the landscaping trade, it's called arborvitae, which means tree of life. And that's often what it's called in places like Kentucky, where it doesn't tend to grow, except where people plant it. And it's a very common landscaping tree. It's all over town as it and some closely related plants are very popular as bushes, ornamental hedges, things like that. Let me find a leaf of it so I can show you what it's like. It's an evergreen and it has a sort of flattened, scaly leaf like this. And if you rub it between your fingers, it starts to feel sort of gummy or sticky, and it has a very distinctive scent to it that is not quite like pines, but sort of similar, sort of piney, sort of almost like bubble gum or something like that. It has a weird sweetness to it, the smell of it. So I want to tell a little story about why it's called arborvitae. Arborvitae means the tree of life. And the reason that it's called the tree of life is, I think, because of a different plant, but some confusion that happened. So when French-speaking people were first starting to come into Canada, let's see, I think the person that was in charge of the expedition was Cartier, Jacques Cartier, and the people on his boat were suffering from some kind of really bad illness, which a lot of modern people think is scurvy. He didn't really know what it was, but he described it some. People were having large swellings around their joints and sores and things like that. And so he went to the native people that were nearby and asked for help. And they treated them with some kind of evergreen called oneta. And he wrote down that it was an evergreen and that the Iroquoian people that were there where he was at called it oneta. And then, you know, he went home. They didn't really establish a settlement at that time or anything, I don't think. But he went home and told his story. And then later on, when some additional other set of French people came to the same area, they asked the native people about a plant called oneta, an evergreen called oneta, and then the native people that they were talking to were like, no, we don't know what that is. We've never heard of it. So the French people at the time thought that they had just lost that knowledge or something like that. But as it turns out, it was just we know from other things that they wrote down the names of, that they were two different groups of people who spoke two completely unrelated languages. And that's why they didn't recognize the name. But at some point, people decided that thuja was this tree, the evergreen tree in question, and they started calling it arbre de vie, the tree of life. Which when they translated that into Latin, instead of calling it the tree of life, they called it arbor vitae, which is the Latin word for the tree of life. So, but among the Iroquoian speaking people that I grew up around, which were the Seneca, I spent some summers on their reservation when I was a kid. They have a plant called oneta, and it is actually the hemlock tree rather than the arborvitae. And hemlock would actually be a pretty good choice if it was scurvy that the people had, because it contains a lot of vitamin C. Arborvitae is not a very nutritive plant. It probably does contain some vitamin C, but it probably would not be your first choice for treating a vitamin C deficiency for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. But I believe that and I mean, the people that he was talking to weren't necessarily Seneca, and it's possible that people speaking another Iroquoian language would have the same name for a different tree. That happens in English. That happens between English and some other languages, for instance, or among European languages in general. Sometimes they have similar names for different trees, so it's possible that something like that happened. And I'm certainly not a native speaker of Seneca, but I do know a lot of plant names, and I do know that one. And it does not refer to thuja; it refers to tsuga, the hemlock tree, which again would be a much better choice if it were scurvy. So I think that thuja got saddled with the name arborvitae by mistake, essentially. That it was not the plant in the story. Its other name, white cedar, is also kind of a misnomer because just like with Eastern red cedar, it's not closely related at all to the cedars of Lebanon, the original tree that was called a cedar. And they're not closely related to each other either. I mean, red cedar and white cedar are not closely related to each other than being conifers. They're not closely related at all. So, people who spoke English just came over here and just gave the same name to plant after plant. So we have, I think, 4 different genera of North American plants that people named cedar, none of which are closely related to the cedars in the Bible that they were naming them after or mistaking them for. I don't know whether they actually thought it was the same plant as they read about in the Bible, or whether they knew it wasn't but wanted to call it the same name. It's not clear to me. But anyway, they gave the same name to plant after plant. And they did that with a lot of plants, and it's kind of frustrating. And it makes me glad that we have botanical names for plants, so that we can know exactly what plant we're talking about. But as far as what thuja actually is good for, the thing that is probably best known for is as a topical treatment for warts. And it contains a substance called podophyllin, which kills the virus that creates warts and also destroys the cells that contain it. And it also contains a bunch of terpenoids, which are this kind of piney scents in plants that are responsible for, they help the skin heal, and they help keratin not to build up so much, which is part of what's happening when there is a wart. It's happening because of viral infection in the cells, but it's causing there to be these big hollow cells called koilocytes, which are just kind of like a shell of keratin with nothing inside them. So it helps to break those. The terpenoids help to break those down. The podophyllin, the alkaloids, help to destroy the virus. And so there are all kinds of thuja-based creams and other products out there for warts. A tincture works pretty well too. You can actually just make a tincture and put it directly on a wart, especially if you make it with a really high level of alcohol. And you can put that directly on a bandage and put that on a wart, and it'll tend to break it down. Most warts will break apart if you just put tape or a bandage over them and allow them to remain covered and remain moist for a while. They'll actually break apart on their own or become very brittle and easily broken apart. But for persistent ones, this will help to keep them from coming back, because it is actually destroying the viruses and the cells that harbor the viruses. So that's one fairly common use of thuja. And if you were to go into the store and find a thuja containing product, it would most likely be for that. And these are topical treatments, it's not used for that internally, it's used for it topically. The thing about podophyllin is, and the alkaloid that's in it, and which is also found in much greater concentrations in mayapple, which we might see this weekend. The podophyllin is also an emetic. So in a pretty substantial dose, the arborvitae would actually make somebody vomit, so it's not something you can really take a lot of internally. Although any toxicity it has is fairly self-limiting for the same reason. You can't really take that much of it without unswallowing it. And so it's hard to do any worse damage than that. But generally speaking, if you are to use it internally, you want to use it as a low dose type of herb. And usually if I'm giving it to somebody, I give it to somebody in a compound with a bunch of other things and have it make a very small amount of it, such that there's not more than about a tablespoon of thuja tincture in whatever bottle I'm giving them. And that way, if they took the whole thing, it wouldn't really make them meaningfully sick. At least not most people. Everybody's stomach is a little bit different in terms of what it will tolerate. but that's usually a dose at which it's pretty tolerable. So I usually don't use more than about a tablespoon in whatever compound I'm giving them. But some of the other properties that it has is that topically it's antiseptic. And there again, the high concentration of alcohol not only helps to dissolve the resins and terpenoids from it, but also adds to the antiseptic effect. So it can be used as something for wounds that if you put it on will kind of form a liquid bandage over the wound, if you use it in that way. If it's taken internally, it's strongly decongestant. It helps to decongest the sinuses. So this is something that I would often use along with spicy things for somebody who has sinuses that have been blocked for a long time. And you see that a lot this time of year where somebody will start having spring allergies, pollen allergies, whatever, and have their sinuses blocked and unmoving and not be able to breathe through their sinuses. And sometimes they'll come to me and say, I haven't been able to breathe through my sinuses in a month, or I haven't been able to breathe through my sinuses in several months sometimes. And what's going on is that they probably have like a thick, hard plug of mucus up in their sinuses, filling up their sinuses and just keeping them from being able to breathe through them or use them at all. So Thuja is actually helpful for breaking that up. If you use spicy stuff, it'll help loose liquid stuff drain. If you use Thuja, it will help to break up some of the harder stuff or the more indurated, more hardened congestion in the sinuses. So I often use it in that type of a scenario. Sometimes I use it along with thyme for respiratory support. Those are the main things that I use it for that are common uses of it. It's like I said, best known as a topical type of thing. As far as taking it as a nutritive, it probably does contain vitamin C like other conifers do, but it's probably, going to be hard to take enough of it to get a meaningful dose, unlike compared to pine needle tea or something like that, where you can just drink a big cup of pine needle tea. If you drink a big cup of arborvitae, you're probably going to be sick. So that's, argues against the possibility that it might have been an herb used for scurvy. So that's it's a like I said, here where I live, it's mostly, and where some of you live also, it's mostly something that people grow rather than something that grows on its own, but it is fairly common as a planted plant. Further north, up in Michigan, Canada, that sort of area, Northeast United States, it's something that you find growing on its own much more often. And so it's, and in those areas, I think people mostly call it white cedar. And in places where people, bought it from a landscaping store, they're more often call it arborvitae. But really, it's not either of those things. So I like to just call it Thuja. It also contains a substance called thujone. And for whatever reason, people have thought, or a lot of people seem to think, that thujone is something of a central nervous system stimulant. A lot of people think that thujone is what made absinthe the famous recreational drug that it was. Absinthe, alcohol that contains wormwood, and wormwood doesn't really contain much thujone. It contains a very small amount of thujone, and it contains lots of other things that affect the brain and nervous system. So, another misunderstanding revolving not directly around this plant, but around a substance, a lactone that is found in this plant. And so Thuja does actually have some mood elevating properties, I guess you could say, but again, they're very slight, they're pretty subtle, and they're fairly self-limiting in actual clinical use, just because you have to use it in such low doses. or, people's stomachs can really only tolerate it in low doses. All right. So any question about either of those herbs? So I have a question that says, for thuja, would you feel comfortable with long-term or daily use in small amounts? Generally speaking, I would. If somebody's getting too much thuja, it usually either looks like raised blood pressure or nausea. And if neither of those things are present, I'm okay with people using it on something of a long-term basis. And on people who have chronic sinus headaches, I do have people that I've been giving compounds that contain thuja for years at a time, and without seeing any ill effects. So yeah, it's often something that people can tolerate on an ongoing basis in low doses, but I do keep an eye on it and look out for the possibility of either blood pressure increases or stomach upset. Yeah. So, I know I keep saying this every week, but I think it's really, especially, this is a very dynamic time of year. So I really encourage everybody, if at all possible, to get out and take a walk in nature, or even just outside somewhere a couple times a week and see what's changing. Notice that some trees are starting to leaf out now. Some trees are coming into bloom. Maple trees are starting to bloom, especially red maples. Oak trees haven't yet. So, and pear trees are kind of reaching the end of their bloom and starting to put out leaves. Apple trees are also starting to put out leaves and maybe starting to come into bloom. This is all where I live, might be a little different where you are, but it's a very dynamic time of year. The trees especially are doing all sorts of different things. And the plants that grow under the trees are responding accordingly. Violets are starting to bloom more and more. Dandelions are pretty much in full bloom right now. You can see hillsides full of them in some places. If you're out in forests, there's things like trilliums and trout lilies, and some of the more showy wildflowers, woodland wildflowers, blooming right now. Wood poppy will start to bloom soon, as will delphinium, which are both very beautiful. Delphinium is purple or white. Wood poppy has yellow flowers. So those are both things that you can see right now, or not right now, actually, probably in the next couple of weeks, maybe right now. I haven't been to the part of the woods that they grow in. But lots of wonderful, beautiful things to see, whether you're in the deep woods or whether you're in the landscapes of suburbia, or wherever you are in the temperate zones right now in the Northern Hemisphere. There's all kinds of dynamic stuff going on. So important to get out there. A lot of the plants are going to be more noticeable right now than they will be later in the year, like the dandelions and the dead nettles. They'll be around all year, but right now they're especially noticeable. They're saying, look at me, here I am. They're really talking to the pollinators and not to you. But if you want to get to know them, now's a great time to go out and see them, because they're really desperate for attention at the moment. So I strongly encourage everybody to spend as much time as you can outdoors all the time, but especially right now, especially in this part of the year. It's a really great way to get to know what's growing around you and where to find it and all that sort of thing. And like I said, Sunday at noon, I'll send out an email with this in writing, but Sunday at noon we can get together and go take a walk in the woods together and see what's growing out there, and hopefully get to see some amazing stuff. And for those of you who still have plant collections to show me, I would love to see them, and hope everybody is doing well with that. And if some of you already have shown me what you have. All right, so any more questions for today? All right, well, thank you all for coming, and I hope to see everybody, or at least almost everybody, on Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will talk to you again soon.